As the night deepens and these thoughts of alternative history drift through your consciousness, consider what such speculation offers us. The past, in one sense, is fixed and unchangeable. What happened at Waterloo on that day in June of 1815 cannot be altered. Wellington won, Napoleon lost, and our world followed from that outcome. Yet, in another sense, history remains alive in our understanding, our interpretations, our awareness that small moments contain vast consequences. The exercise of imagining how the world might have unfolded differently serves more than idle curiosity. It reminds us that history is not inevitable, that human choices and accidents of fortune shape the paths nations and peoples follow. The alternative Europe we have explored, where Napoleon's victory at Waterloo created a different 19th century, differs from our actual history in countless particulars. Yet perhaps the underlying forces of industrial transformation, national awakening, imperial expansion, and social change would have asserted themselves in any case, finding different specific expressions, but similar general patterns. What would have been gained and what lost in that alternative world? French power and influence extending across Europe for decades longer brings with it both Napoleon's meritocratic ideals, his legal reforms, his support for education and technical progress, and also his autocracy, his censorship, his willingness to sacrifice lives for imperial ambition. The Napoleonic Code and administrative rationality coexist with secret police and restricted freedoms. The world is complex, and the judgments we make about historical figures and systems must account for this complexity. The peoples of Europe in that alternative timeline would have faced their own struggles for freedom, participation, and dignity. Whether under Napoleonic Empire, restored monarchy, or eventually more democratic systems, humans strive for better lives and greater voice in their governance. The specific institutions and borders matter, but the underlying human desires and conflicts transcend particular political arrangements. The workers seeking fair wages and decent conditions, the intellectuals demanding freedom of thought and expression, the nationalists yearning for self-determination, all these forces would express themselves in that alternative world as in our own. The technological transformation of the 19th century, those railways and factories and telegraph lines that revolutionized human life, would have proceeded in either timeline. The scientific discoveries that revealed nature's secrets and the artistic achievements that expressed human creativity and emotion would have emerged regardless of who ruled in Paris or Vienna. Human ingenuity and imagination, the curiosity that drives science, and the passion that creates art, these continue regardless of political systems. Perhaps the lesson of alternative history is humility about historical inevitability and certainty. We tell stories about the past that make sense, that create narratives of cause and effect, that identify turning points and explain outcomes. These stories contain truth, but they also simplify an infinitely complex reality. For every event that occurred, countless other possibilities existed. The path we followed was not the only path possible, and the world we inhabit is not the only world that could have been. As you drift towards sleep, the alternative Europe we have explored fades like a dream, a vision of what might have been but was not. The actual history remains, with all its triumphs and tragedies, its achievements and its sorrows. Napoleon did fall at Waterloo. The 19th century followed the path we know, leading eventually to our present. Yet in the space between waking and sleeping, in the twilight realm where imagination roams free, we can visit those worlds that might have been, explore the roads not taken,
and consider how fragile and contingent the bridge between past and present truly is. Sleep now, and let these thoughts settle into the deeper places where history and dream, possibility and memory all merge into the rich tapestry of human consciousness. The questions raised by alternative history have no final answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. They invite us to think, to wonder, to consider how we arrived at this present moment and what other presents might have been. In the morning, the actual world awaits, but for now, in the gentle darkness, all possibilities exist together, all timelines converge, and Napoleon's Europe, that empire that fell and that empire that might have endured, lives side by side in the realm of historical imagination. Rest well, thoughtful traveler through time's many paths.
Welcome to another scenario of alternative history, thoughts you get before going to sleep. Tonight, we journey to a moment that changed the world, a single day where the fate of empires hung in the balance, and we ask, what if that balance had tipped the other way? Imagine the fields of Waterloo on the 18th of June in the year 1815. The morning mist clings to the Belgian countryside, and the ground beneath thousands of boots is still soft from the rain that fell through the night. In our world, this day became the final curtain for Napoleon Bonaparte, the moment when the grand empire he had built across Europe came crashing down beneath the combined might of British, Prussian, Dutch, and German forces. But what if the rain had not delayed his attack? What if Marshal Grouchy had arrived in time with his 30,000 men? What if a single cavalry charge had broken through at a different moment, or a cannonball had found a different target? Consider a world where Napoleon Bonaparte wins the Battle of Waterloo. Not through some miracle or fantasy, but through the realistic margins that often separate victory from defeat in warfare. Perhaps the Prussian forces under Blücher are delayed by an extra few hours, their march through muddy roads proving more difficult than in our timeline. Perhaps Marshal Ney's cavalry charges against the British squares succeed in breaking the infantry formations at a critical moment. Perhaps Napoleon's Imperial Guard, those veterans of 100 battles, makes their final charge earlier in the day when both armies are fresher, and this time they do not falter. The Duke of Wellington, in our history, said that Waterloo was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, the battle balanced on a knife's edge. In this alternative history, that balance tips the other way. The British lines break in the late afternoon. Wellington is forced to order a retreat, and his army begins to fall back toward Brussels in increasingly disorganized fashion. The Prussians arrive to find not a battle they can turn, but a rout they cannot stop. Napoleon, standing on the field as the sun sets on that crucial day, knows he has won more than just a battle. He has won survival. He has won time. He has won the possibility of negotiating from a position of strength rather than unconditional surrender. The immediate aftermath of this victory sends shockwaves through Europe. In Paris, the news arrives like lightning. The emperor has done the impossible once more. The Allies, who had already been preparing to march on France to finish what they started, now hesitate. The coalition forces begin to reconsider their absolute demands. The Russian Tsar Alexander, the Austrian Emperor Francis, and the Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm must confront a reality they thought they had already eliminated. Napoleon is not defeated. His army, far from broken, is victorious and dangerous. The Congress of Vienna, which had been redrawing the map of Europe without French input, suddenly must reckon with French power once more. Wellington retreats across the Channel, his reputation damaged but not destroyed. The Prussian army pulls back to regroup,
and Napoleon, exhausted but triumphant, begins the delicate work of transforming military victory into political survival. He knows he cannot fight all of Europe forever. His resources are limited, his people weary of war. But from a position of victory, he can negotiate, he can demand terms, he can shape the future of Europe in ways that would have been impossible after defeat. The point of divergence is not just a battle, but a door opening onto an entirely different world. Through that door, we can see the outline of a Europe that never quite escapes Napoleon's shadow, where the ideas he spread by conquest and law continue to reshape nations for generations. The old order, which in our history was restored after Waterloo, finds itself unable to simply turn back the clock. The changes Napoleon brought, the nationalist sentiments he awakened, the legal codes he established, the administrative reforms he implemented, all these things now have breathing room to take deeper root.
The months following Waterloo reshape Europe with unexpected swiftness. Napoleon, understanding that he cannot sustain total war against the coalition indefinitely, makes a calculated decision that surprises even his closest advisors. Rather than attempt to reconquer all of Europe, he offers peace terms from a position of strength. The Treaty of Brussels, signed in the autumn of 1815, represents a compromise that leaves no party entirely satisfied, but all parties willing to accept rather than continue a devastating war. France retains its natural frontiers along the Rhine and the Alps, territories it had claimed during the Revolutionary Wars. The Kingdom of Italy, nominally independent but under French influence, continues to exist in the north of the Italian peninsula. The German states remain reorganized under the Confederation of the Rhine, though with greater autonomy than before. The Netherlands and Belgium form a buffer kingdom, and Spain returns to Bourbon rule but with a constitution influenced by Napoleonic law. Britain retains its naval supremacy and its colonies, while Russia, Austria, and Prussia receive assurances about their own spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. It is not the empire Napoleon dreamed of, but it is not the total defeat he avoided either. The compromise leaves him ruling France and exercising indirect influence over much of continental Europe, while the other great powers maintain their independence and prestige. Most importantly for Napoleon, the Treaty of Brussels recognizes him as the legitimate ruler of France, ending the question of Bourbon restoration that had haunted him since his return from Elba. Within France itself, the immediate aftermath of Waterloo's victory creates a complex political situation. Napoleon knows his throne still rests on uncertain foundations. The French people are war-weary. The economic strain of decades of conflict has left the treasury depleted and many families mourning lost sons. To consolidate his position, Napoleon takes steps that seem almost contradictory to his earlier autocratic rule. He allows the Chamber of Deputies greater authority, creating what some historians in this timeline call the Second Liberal Empire. Press censorship is relaxed, though not eliminated. Property rights are reinforced. The concordat with the Catholic Church is honored and strengthened. These reforms serve multiple purposes. They placate the moderate liberals who had briefly seized power during the 100 Days before Waterloo. They reassure the European powers that France under Napoleon might be a stable neighbor rather than a revolutionary threat. And they create space for economic recovery, which Napoleon understands is essential for long-term stability. The Code Napoleon, that comprehensive legal reform that had been one of his earlier achievements, is now refined and fully implemented across France and its sphere of influence, creating a standardized legal framework that facilitates trade and administration. The military remains central to Napoleon's power, but even here changes occur. The army is gradually reduced from its wartime peak, though it remains the largest and best trained force in Europe.
Veterans are given land grants and pensions, creating a class of stakeholders invested in the regime's survival. Military academies are expanded, emphasizing not just warfare, but also engineering and administration. Napoleon, always fascinated by technical progress, begins to direct military resources towards civil projects, roads, bridges, and canals that benefit the economy while keeping the army employed and skilled. In the years from 1815 to 1820, Europe experiences an uneasy peace. Small conflicts erupt on the periphery. The Greek struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire unfolds differently than in our timeline, with France supporting the Greek rebels as a counterweight to Austrian and Russian influence in the Balkans. Revolutionary movements in Spanish America continue, but with a France that is not defeated, the dynamics of these independence struggles shift in subtle ways. The other European powers watch France warily, but do not immediately move to destroy the settlement. Britain focuses on its maritime empire and industrial development. Russia consolidates its control over Poland and looks eastward toward the Ottoman Empire. Austria struggles with the nationalist tensions within its diverse empire. Prussia begins the slow process of building its industrial and military strength. The balance of power is maintained not through the complete suppression of France, as happened in our timeline, but through a more complex equilibrium where French power is acknowledged but contained. Napoleon himself ages into his 50s between these years. The man who once rode across battlefields from Spain to Russia now spends more time in administrative meetings and diplomatic correspondence. He marries again after the death of Marie Louise, this time to a French noblewoman, seeking to connect his dynasty more firmly to the old aristocracy. His son, the young Napoleon II, receives a careful education designed to prepare him for eventual succession. The question of dynasty, which seemed settled by defeat in our timeline, becomes a central preoccupation in this one.
As the 1820s unfold, the political landscape of Europe takes forms that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Congress system, which in our timeline dominated European politics after Napoleon's defeat, exists in this alternative history, but in a fundamentally different form. France is not excluded, but rather becomes one of the 5 great powers managing European affairs. The regular meetings of ambassadors and foreign ministers now include French representatives, creating a pentarchy of France, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia that manages continental affairs through negotiation rather than the hegemony of any single alliance. This inclusion of France, however, comes with a price. Napoleon must moderate his ambitions and work within a framework of multilateral diplomacy. The revolutionary fervor that once characterized French foreign policy is tempered by the need to maintain the Treaty of Brussels. Yet French influence permeates Europe in subtler ways than military conquest. The Code Napoleon spreads not through force, but through voluntary adoption. German states, Italian principalities, and even some parts of Spain find that the clarity and rationality of Napoleonic law offers advantages over their traditional legal systems. Legal reformers across Europe study French administrative practices and implement modified versions in their own countries. The question of succession and legitimacy shapes political developments throughout this period. In France, Napoleon works to establish his dynasty as permanent rather than revolutionary. The Senate and the Chamber of Deputies are given greater powers, but within a framework that ensures Bonapartist dominance. A delicate balance emerges where limited political participation satisfies liberal demands while maintaining centralized authority. It is neither absolute monarchy nor democracy, but something in between, a constitutional empire that adapts to survive. The German Confederation evolves differently than in our timeline. Without the complete defeat of France, the German constates remain organized in the Confederation of the Rhine, which gradually transforms into a structure somewhat similar to the German Confederation of our timeline, but with stronger French connections. Prussia grows stronger within this framework,
but its path to unifying Germany is blocked by French influence and Austrian opposition. The result is a Germany that remains fragmented longer, with multiple centers of power in Berlin, Vienna's German territories, and the Rhine states that maintain their French ties. Italy experiences perhaps the most dramatic political shift. The Kingdom of Italy in the north, established under French auspices, continues to exist and gradually expands its administration and identity. Italian nationalism, which in our timeline grew partly in opposition to French occupation, in this world develops in dialogue with French influence. The peninsula remains divided, but the north begins to develop a sense of Italian identity that is distinct from both Austrian control and papal authority. Nationalist thinkers in Milan and Turin imagine an eventual unified Italy, but one that might exist in partnership with France rather than in opposition to it. Spain and Portugal follow complicated paths in this altered timeline. The Bourbon Restoration in Spain occurs, but the constitution remains more liberal than in our history, influenced by the years of French occupation and the need to compete with French political models. The Spanish-American revolutions continue, but Spain's approach to its rebellious colonies is affected by a Europe where France remains powerful. Some colonial reforms are attempted, though ultimately they prove too little too late and independence movements still succeed. However, the timing and specific outcomes of these revolutions differ from our timeline. In Britain, the political reaction to this new European order proves complex. On one hand, the failure to completely defeat Napoleon at Waterloo initially appears as a strategic setback. The Tory government faces criticism, and there are calls for continued war. However, as the Treaty of Brussels proves stable and French behavior becomes more predictable, a different perspective emerges. Britain turns its attention increasingly toward its maritime empire, its industrial development, and global trade. The Industrial Revolution, already underway, accelerates as Britain focuses on economic rather than purely military competition with France. The British Parliament gradually evolves its own reforms, partly in response to the changing European situation. The recognition that France has adopted some liberal constitutional elements while Britain remains unreformed creates political pressure. The movement toward the Great Reform Act, which in our timeline occurred in 1832, begins earlier in this alternative history, driven by the need to demonstrate British political vitality in comparison to Napoleonic France. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, takes a different path than in our timeline. The Congress of Vienna's Holy Alliance still forms, but without complete victory over France, it has a different character. Alexander's mystical conservatism is tempered by the need to work with a powerful France. The question of Poland, always sensitive, remains complex, with French influence providing some counterweight to Russian control. In the vast expanses of Russia itself, the Tsar faces the perennial question of reform versus tradition, with the example of French administration offering both attraction and threat.
Consider the daily life in this alternative Europe, where Napoleon's influence continues to shape society. In the cities of France during the 1820s and 1830s, a unique cultural atmosphere develops. Paris, never having experienced the humiliation of occupied defeat as in our timeline, maintains and even enhances its position as Europe's cultural capital. The salons of the city buzz with intellectual activity. Writers, artists, and philosophers gather to debate the nature of governance, liberty, and progress. The café culture flourishes as a space where ideas circulate with relative freedom, constrained by censorship but not crushed by it. The educational reforms that Napoleon had begun earlier now have time to mature and expand. The lycées, those secondary schools designed to create an educated citizenry and bureaucratic class, multiply across France and its sphere of influence. The emphasis on merit over birth, while never perfect in practice, becomes more deeply embedded in French society. A young man from the provinces, if talented and ambitious, can aspire to positions in government,
law, or the military that would have been closed to him under the old regime. This meritocratic principle, however imperfectly realized, distinguishes French society from much of the rest of Europe. Women's position in this society remains limited by the standards of later eras, but subtle changes occur. The Code Napoleon, while restrictive in many ways regarding women's legal rights, also standardizes and clarifies their status in property and inheritance. In the absence of the complete reaction that followed Napoleon's defeat in our timeline, some of the more progressive voices advocating for women's education and legal rights find slightly more space to be heard. The salons, often hosted by educated women, remain important centers of intellectual life. Literary women like George Sand emerge in this timeline as well, pushing against social boundaries while benefiting from the slightly more flexible cultural atmosphere. Language itself bears Napoleon's imprint across Europe. French, already the language of diplomacy, becomes even more dominant in this timeline. In the Rhineland, in northern Italy, in the Low Countries, educated people speak French as their second language, creating a linguistic commonwealth that facilitates the spread of ideas and trade. Regional languages and dialects persist, but French serves as the universal tongue of administration, law, and high culture throughout Napoleon's sphere of influence. This linguistic unification, while resented by some as cultural imperialism, proves economically and administratively efficient. Religious life adapts to the new realities of this alternative Europe. The Catholic Church, having made its peace with Napoleon through the Concordat, maintains its influence, but within a framework of state authority. In France and territories under French influence, the Church performs its spiritual role, while the state controls education, civil registration, and many aspects of public life. This arrangement, which some clergy resent but most accept, creates a model of church-state relations that differs from the complete separation in the new American Republic and the close identification of throne and altar in Russia or Austria. Protestant communities in the Rhineland and other French-influenced territories experience a degree of toleration that varies by region, but generally allows for religious practice within the bounds of civil law. Jewish communities, granted citizenship under Napoleon's reforms, continued to integrate into French society with varying degrees of success and resistance. In this timeline, the slow process of Jewish emancipation and integration in Western Europe proceeds somewhat faster than in our history, though prejudice and restrictions certainly persist. The arts flourish in this environment of relative stability punctuated by political tension. The Romantic movement in literature and art develops differently than in our timeline. Where in our history Romanticism often took on nationalist and anti-French characteristics in Germany and elsewhere, in this alternative world it develops in a more complex relationship with French culture. German Romantics still emphasize Germanic traditions and culture, but they do so within a political framework where French influence is an established fact rather than a foreign occupation to be expelled. Music evolves with the changing times. Beethoven, having lived through the Napoleonic era and its aftermath, composes in a world where the French emperor he once admired and then rejected remains a living presence. The late works of Beethoven and the early works of composers like Berlioz take on different shadings in a Europe where revolutionary ideals haven't been completely suppressed by reactionary restoration. Fashion, always a marker of cultural influence, shows French predominance. The styles of Paris dictate taste across much of Europe. The empire waist, neoclassical influences, and eventually the more elaborate styles of the 1830s spread from French houses to other capitals. Men's fashion, having moved towards simpler, more practical styles during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, continues in this direction, with the formal wear of businessmen and bureaucrats becoming standardized across Europe. Daily routines and social structures show the impact of decades of French influence. The café becomes a central institution in urban life, not just in Paris, but in Brussels, Cologne, Milan, and other cities. Public spaces are designed with French sensibilities, emphasizing rational planning and monumental architecture. The boulevards that Baron Haussmann will later create in Paris in our timeline begin their conceptual development earlier in this alternative history, as Napoleon and his advisors think about urban planning as both practical and symbolic.
The economic landscape of this alternative Europe reflects the persistence of French power in ways both obvious and subtle. The continental system, that attempt to exclude British goods from European markets, which had caused such hardship in our timeline, is not abandoned after Waterloo, but rather transformed. The Treaty of Brussels includes trade provisions that regulate but do not completely prohibit British commerce with the continent. What emerges is a complex system of tariffs, trade agreements, and smuggling that characterizes European commerce in the 1820s and 1830s. France, no longer bearing the full cost of total warfare, begins a period of economic recovery and development. The infrastructure projects that Napoleon favored, interrupted by constant military campaigns in our timeline, receives sustained attention in this alternative history. The road network expanding from Paris to all corners of France improves, facilitating internal trade. Canals connect river systems, reducing transport costs. The system of departments and prefects, that administrative rationalization that Napoleon imposed, proves economically efficient by standardizing regulations and reducing traditional barriers to commerce. The financial system develops differently as well. The Bank of France, established earlier in Napoleon's rule, becomes more stable and influential without the catastrophic expenses of defeat and reparations. French government bonds, backed by a state that avoided complete collapse, become attractive investments, not just domestically, but across Europe. This financial stability allows for investment in industrial development, though France lags behind Britain in the race toward industrialization. The Industrial Revolution, that transformation of production and society that was accelerating in Britain, proceeds at a different pace in this alternative Europe. Britain, secure in its island and focused on technological development, continues to lead in mechanization, factory production, and coal-based industry. However, in this timeline, industrial technology and techniques spread to the continent somewhat faster than in our history. French entrepreneurs, engineers, and government officials, not distracted by political collapse and restoration, pay attention to British developments and work to adapt them. The textile mills of northern France, the mining operations in Belgium and the Rhineland, all develop with government support and protection. Napoleon's interest in technical education and engineering creates institutions that foster industrial development. The École Polytechnique and similar technical schools produce engineers and industrialists who begin to close the gap with Britain, though not to surpass it. The emphasis on applied science and practical innovation becomes a hallmark of French education, spreading to countries under French influence. A culture of technical progress, supported by state resources and meritocratic advancement, begins to emerge. Trade routes reorient to accommodate the new political reality. Mediterranean commerce, partially under French influence through the Kingdom of Italy and good relations with some North African states, flourishes. French merchants and naval officers explore possibilities in these regions. The competition with Britain for global influence remains intense, but not completely one-sided. In the Americas, French merchants and investors,
no longer completely shut out by British naval dominance and the restoration of the Bourbons, maintain a presence in trade with the newly independent Latin American nations. Agricultural production in France and its sphere of influence modernizes gradually. The redistribution of land that occurred during the Revolutionary period, consolidated under Napoleon, creates a class of property-owning peasants who have a stake in agricultural improvement. New techniques spread through agricultural societies and government promotion. The rural economy, while remaining traditional in many ways, begins the slow transition toward more productive methods and market orientation. The guild system, weakened or abolished in territories under French law, gives way to a more flexible labor market. This change facilitates industrial development, but also creates social tensions as traditional craftsmen face competition from factory production. Urban workers begin to form mutual aid societies and early labor organizations, operating in the limited space allowed by authorities wary of political unrest, but recognizing the need for some social cohesion. Banking and finance develop sophisticated networks across this alternative Europe. The Rothschild family and other banking dynasties, operating across national borders, facilitate the flow of capital and credit. They finance government borrowing, industrial ventures, and international trade. The persistence of Napoleon's empire actually provides some stability for these financial operations, as the rules of commerce, based on French legal principles, remain relatively consistent across a large territory. Colonial trade takes on different dimensions in this world. France, having retained more of its power, maintains stronger influence in its remaining colonies in the Caribbean, West Africa, and Indian Ocean. While the age of European imperial expansion in Africa and Asia is still in the future, French merchants and naval officers explore possibilities in these regions. The competition with Britain for global influence remains active, with neither side achieving complete dominance. The long-term economic impact of this alternative history is a Europe where Britain maintains its industrial lead, but faces more significant continental competition than in our timeline. The process of industrialization, instead of being overwhelmingly British for decades before spreading, begins to diffuse across northwestern Europe more rapidly. This creates a different economic balance with multiple centers of industrial production rather than overwhelming British predominance.
In the realm of knowledge and discovery, this alternative Europe, where Napoleon's influence persists, creates a distinctive atmosphere for scientific and technological advancement. Napoleon himself, always fascinated by science and technology, continues to patronize researchers and inventors. The Institut de France, that assembly of learned societies, including the Academy of Sciences, receives consistent government support and attention. Scientists and mathematicians, not scattered by defeat and political upheaval, continue their work with some degree of institutional stability. The emphasis on technical education that Napoleon championed produces a generation of engineers and scientists trained in rigorous mathematical and practical methods. The École Polytechnique becomes a model imitated in other European countries. Students from across the continent come to Paris to study engineering, mathematics, and applied science, then return home to establish similar institutions. This creates a network of technical expertise that gradually spreads industrial and scientific knowledge beyond national borders. In mathematics and theoretical science, French scholars continue the tradition established by figures like Lagrange and Laplace. The development of mathematical analysis, probability theory, and mathematical physics proceeds with strong French contributions. In our timeline, some French scientists left France during or after the Napoleonic Wars, or faced restricted conditions afterward. In this alternative history, continuity of institutional support allows for sustained research programs.
The connections between pure mathematics and engineering applications, always strong in the French tradition, are reinforced by government interest in practical applications. Chemistry advances significantly in this period, with both French and German chemists making important discoveries. The classification of elements, the understanding of chemical reactions, and the beginnings of organic chemistry proceed through collaboration and competition across national boundaries. French chemists benefit from good laboratory facilities and government interest in applications, ranging from dyeing textiles to manufacturing explosives. The chemical industry begins to develop, particularly in France and the Rhineland, creating both economic opportunities and environmental challenges. Physics during these decades makes fundamental advances in understanding electricity, magnetism, and thermodynamics. Researchers across Europe contribute to these developments, but French scientists play a prominent role, benefiting from institutional support and technical infrastructure. The relationship between scientific research and practical application, always important to Napoleon, means that discoveries in physics quickly get investigated for possible uses in industry, communication, and warfare. Medicine and public health advance through a combination of scientific research and administrative action. The French system of medical education, standardized under Napoleon, produces physicians trained in clinical observation and basic scientific principles. The understanding of contagious disease remains incomplete in these decades before germ theory, but public health measures like quarantines, sanitation improvements, and vaccination against smallpox spread through government action. Napoleon's empire, with its emphasis on administrative rationality, implements public health measures more systematically than some other European states. The biological sciences make progress through patient observation and collection. The Museum of Natural History in Paris continues as a major center for botanical and zoological research. Expeditions to distant parts of the world, sometimes with government support, bring back specimens and observations. The development of evolutionary ideas, which in our timeline would culminate in Darwin's work later in the 19th century, proceeds through research of French naturalists like Lamarck and others who propose early theories of species change. In technology and engineering, the continuing patronage of the French state drives innovation in certain areas. Military technology receives consistent attention, with improvements in artillery, small arms, and fortifications. Napoleon's interest in mobility and logistics stimulates work on roads, bridges, and eventually on the early railways that begin to appear in the 1830s. The first railway lines in this alternative Europe are built both in Britain and on the continent, with French engineers actively involved in adapting and improving British innovations. Communication technology advances as well. The telegraph system, using semaphore towers, which France had earlier developed, is maintained and expanded. When electrical telegraphy begins to emerge in the 1830s, French scientists and engineers are among those working on its development. The importance of rapid communication for both military and administrative purposes ensures government interest and support for these innovations. Industrial technology, while still led by British innovation in many areas, diffuses to the continent with less delay than in our timeline. French, Belgian, and Rhineland industrialists, with government encouragement and sometimes support, adopt steam power, mechanized production, and new manufacturing techniques. The technology transfer occurs through industrial espionage, the hiring of skilled British workers, and sometimes through legitimate licensing and partnership. The result is a continental Europe that industrializes somewhat faster than in our history, though still trailing Britain's head start. The printing industry and publishing develop robustly in this environment. Despite censorship, there is enough freedom for scientific journals, technical manuals, and educational materials to circulate widely. The standardization of language and education across much of continental Europe under Napoleon's influence facilitates the spread of printed knowledge. Literacy rates begin to rise, particularly in urban areas and among the middle classes. Natural philosophy, the predecessor to our modern sciences, begins to fragment into specialized disciplines during this period. Chemistry, physics, biology, and geology emerge as distinct fields with their own methods and communities of practitioners. Scientific societies, not just in Paris but in other cities as well, provide forums for presenting research and debating ideas. The international character of science persists despite political divisions, with researchers corresponding across borders and traveling to attend meetings and visit laboratories.
Beyond Europe, the persistence of Napoleonic power creates ripples that wash across the world in unexpected ways. In the Americas, the age of revolution and independence takes a somewhat different course. The Spanish colonies, having begun their independence struggles during the Napoleonic Wars, continue their revolutions but in a geopolitical context where France remains a significant power. Some revolutionary leaders seeking European support against Spain and potentially against British influence look to France as a potential ally or model. The liberal constitutionalism that Napoleon eventually embraced influences political thought in Buenos Aires, Caracas, and Mexico City. Brazil's path toward independence from Portugal unfolds with Portugal itself affected by this altered European situation. The Portuguese royal family, which had fled to Brazil during the Napoleonic Wars, faces different pressures in returning to Europe. The eventual independence of Brazil and the political arrangements made during that transition bear subtle influences from French political ideas competing with British interests in the region. The United States, having fought Britain in the War of 1812, observes the European balance of power with interest. In this alternative timeline, the Monroe Doctrine, which in our history had declared European interference in the Americas unwelcome, takes on a more complex character. With France remaining powerful and having interests in the Western Hemisphere, American foreign policy must navigate a more complicated European presence. French ideas about governance and law, already influential through the Louisiana Purchase and the Napoleonic Code's influence on Louisiana law, circulate more widely in American intellectual circles. The debate between different visions of the American Republic, Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian, acquires additional nuances from French examples. In the Caribbean, French influence persists more strongly than in our timeline. The colony of Haiti, having achieved its independence through revolutionary struggle, maintains a complicated relationship with France. Napoleon, no longer able to attempt reconquest, but also not completely defeated, negotiates a settlement that recognizes Haitian independence in exchange for some trade concessions and financial arrangements. This allows Haiti to develop with less international isolation than in our history, though it still faces enormous challenges of poverty, political instability, and racial tensions. North Africa, particularly the Barbary Coast and Egypt, remains an area of French interest and occasional intervention. The French expedition to Algeria, which in our timeline began in 1830, might occur earlier or under different circumstances in this alternative history. French commercial and naval interests in the Mediterranean drive a more aggressive policy toward North African states. The Ottoman Empire itself, that vast declining power stretching from the Balkans to the Middle East and North Africa, experiences the persistence of French power as a complicating factor. In our timeline, European powers gradually encroached on Ottoman territory through a combination of war and diplomacy, with Russia as the primary threat. In this alternative history, France provides some counterweight to Russian expansion, seeking to maintain influence in the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. The Greek independence struggle, the Egyptian question, and the gradual disintegration of Ottoman control all proceed somewhat differently, with France as an active player in Near Eastern politics. In South and Southeast Asia, European imperial competition takes on different dimensions. The British Empire in India continues its expansion, but French interests in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia, not completely eliminated by British dominance as in our history, create rivalry and competition.
French merchants, missionaries, and eventually colonial administrators maintain a presence in places like Indochina and the Indian Ocean Islands. The relationship between European powers in Asia involves more balanced competition, with France as Britain's primary rival rather than a defeated and marginalized power. China, entering what historians call the Century of Humiliation, faces European pressure in this alternative history, with France as one of the aggressive powers alongside Britain. The Opium Wars and the subsequent opening of China to European trade and influence involve French participation more centrally than in our history. The French Catholic missions in China have somewhat stronger backing from their home government. The gradual carving of China into spheres of influence proceeds with France as an active participant from the beginning. Japan, still isolated in the 1820s and 1830s during this alternative history, will eventually face Western pressure to open its ports. When that moment comes, France will be one of the powers demanding access, alongside the United States, Britain, and Russia. The French presence in East Asia, stronger than in our timeline, affects the calculations Japanese leaders make about modernization and international relations. Sub-Saharan Africa remains largely unknown to Europeans during this period, with contact limited to coastal trading posts. However, the persistence of French power means that French explorers, traders, and missionaries begin their penetration of the African interior somewhat earlier than in our history. The eventual scramble for Africa, which in our history occurred later in the 19th century, has its seeds planted differently when France maintained significant power throughout the early decades of the century.
Imagine Europe in the 1850s, a full generation after the Battle of Waterloo unfolded on those Belgian fields. Napoleon Bonaparte has died, perhaps in the 1840s, having lived to see his dynasty established and his empire, if not expanded, at least secured. His son, Napoleon II, rules France, though whether as effectively as his father is a question that dominates political discussion. The young emperor faces challenges his father never fully resolved, tensions between liberal demands for greater political participation and conservative desires for order and authority. The cities of this alternative Europe bear Napoleon's lasting imprint. Paris has grown into a metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants, with grand boulevards and public buildings that express imperial power and rational planning. The modernization of Paris, which in our timeline occurred under Napoleon III later in the century, begins earlier in this alternative history under the direct line of Napoleonic succession. Gaslighting illuminates the streets. Railway stations bustle with travelers, moving between cities at speeds unimaginable a generation earlier. The pace of life has quickened with technological change. The railway revolution transforms Europe's geography in this alternative timeline, much as it did in ours, but with some differences in pattern. The first railways appear in both Britain and on the continent in the 1830s, and by the 1850s, iron rails connect major cities across Western Europe. However, in this alternative history, the railway network develops somewhat more systematically on the continent under state guidance and planning. The French government, understanding the strategic and economic importance of railways, supports their construction with regulations, subsidies, and sometimes direct state ownership. The result is a railway system that connects Paris to the major cities of France and extends into the Rhineland, Belgium, and northern Italy. Industry has transformed the landscape and society of this alternative Europe. The manufacturing centers of northern England remain the most advanced, with steam-powered textile mills, iron foundries, and coal mines that blacken the sky and water. But the continent has not stood still. The regions along the Rhine, in Belgium and in northern France, have developed their own industrial centers. Textile production, iron and steel making, coal mining, and increasingly machine building have created urban working classes and industrial bourgeoisies that change the social structure of these societies. The question that dominates political discussion across Europe in this alternative 1850s is how societies should adapt to industrial transformation, at what rights and participation the growing middle and working classes should have. In Britain, the Chartist movement and debates over electoral reform reflect working class demands for political voice.
In France and the territories under French influence, similar demands arise, though channeled through the particular political structures Napoleon left. Labor organizations, though still restricted and watched by authorities, begin to form and articulate demands for better conditions, shorter working hours, and eventually political participation. Intellectual life in this alternative Europe has produced its own currents of thought. Socialist ideas, emerging from the contradictions and hardships of industrial capitalism, find expression through thinkers and agitators across the continent. The specific forms these ideas take differ somewhat from our timeline. In a Europe where Napoleon's meritocratic principles and legal rationalism remain influential, socialist thought engages with French traditions of equality and citizenship. The revolutions of 1848, which swept across Europe in our timeline, occur in this alternative history as well, though with different specific dynamics in a continent where French power remains strong and the political structures differ. In the German lands, the question of national unification remains unresolved. Prussia has grown stronger, building its military and industrial capacity, but the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, which occurred in our timeline through Bismarck's wars in the 1860s and 1870s, faces greater obstacles. French opposition to German unification, backed by French power and alliances with some German states, prevents the rise of a unified German empire. The result is a Germany that remains divided, though with growing nationalist sentiment that cannot find political expression. This creates tensions that will eventually demand resolution through some form of conflict or negotiation. Italy similarly remains divided in this alternative 1850s, though the Kingdom of Italy in the north has solidified as a real state with French support or at least acquiescence. The Papal States, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south, and various smaller territories make the Italian peninsula a patchwork. Italian nationalism, inspired by thinkers and revolutionaries, dreams of unification, but must contend with French interests, Austrian power, and the complex realities of regional differences and papal sovereignty. The path toward Italian unification, which in our timeline was largely complete by 1870, will take a different route in this alternative history. The global reach of European power has extended dramatically by this point. The age of high imperialism approaches, and in this alternative world, France participates more fully in colonial expansion. French territories in Algeria, Indochina, and West Africa grow. The competition for colonies and spheres of influence which characterized late 19th century imperialism in our timeline begins earlier and involves France as a more equal competitor with Britain. The humanitarian costs of imperial expansion, the exploitation of colonized peoples, the extraction of resources, all these proceed with France as an active participant in the darker aspects of European global dominance. The United States in this alternative mid-19th century has expanded westward to the Pacific, fought its devastating Civil War, or perhaps avoided it through different political compromises. American development proceeds influenced by the different European political balance. Trade with Europe, immigration from Europe, intellectual exchanges all flow across the Atlantic in patterns affected by French power alongside British influence. The American experiment in democracy exists in a world where French constitutional empire and British parliamentary monarchy provide different models of governance. Russia, vast and still predominantly agricultural, modernizes slowly in the shadow of European developments. The Crimean War, which in our timeline exposed Russian military weaknesses, might occur differently in this alternative history, with French participation potentially on a different side. Russian serfdom, an institution increasingly anachronistic by mid-century, faces pressure for reform from internal critics who point to Western European developments. When reform comes, as it eventually must, the example of French peasant land ownership competes with other models in the Russian debate.
Consider now the paths that diverged from that day at Waterloo, the differences between the world we know and the alternative history we have explored. In our timeline, Napoleon's defeat was total and decisive. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821, only 6 years after Waterloo. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, and the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe to contain French power and restore the old order as much as possible. The concert of Europe,
dominated by conservative powers, managed continental affairs for decades, suppressing revolutionary and nationalist movements. In our actual history, France experienced a period of restoration and reaction after Waterloo. The liberal and meritocratic reforms of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods were partially reversed. The Bourbon monarchy, though it never fully turned back the clock, represented a conservative restoration that disappointed those who had hoped for constitutional government and greater political participation. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 in France stemmed partly from this disappointment and the blocked aspirations of middle and working classes. The German lands in our timeline eventually unified under Prussian leadership in the 1870s through Bismarck's wars against Austria and France. The unification of Germany as a powerful, militarized state in the center of Europe fundamentally changed the European balance of power and set the stage for the conflicts of the 20th century. In the alternative history we have explored, German unification faces greater obstacles due to French power, potentially preventing or delaying the rise of the unified German state that proved so consequential. Italy's unification in our timeline occurred through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and popular support, largely completed by 1870. The Kingdom of Italy emerged as a constitutional monarchy that united most of the peninsula, though it faced enormous challenges of regional disparity, poverty, and political instability. In the alternative history, Italian unification might proceed differently, perhaps creating a different kind of Italian state, or even maintaining division longer. The British Empire in our timeline dominated the 19th century, particularly after defeating France at Waterloo. British naval supremacy, industrial leadership, and colonial expansion proceeded with minimal effective competition for much of the century. The Pax Britannica rested on this overwhelming British power. In the alternative history we have explored, British power, while still formidable, faces more effective French competition, preventing complete British dominance and maintaining a more balanced multipolar system. The United States in our actual history developed largely free from European interference after the War of 1812. The Monroe Doctrine's declaration that the Americas were closed to European colonization was possible partly because European powers were preoccupied with their own affairs, and Britain's navy prevented European intervention while pursuing free trade policies that benefited American commerce. In the alternative history, American development might face more direct European, particularly French, involvement in hemispheric affairs. The colonial empires in our timeline developed with Britain as the dominant imperial power, though France, Germany, Belgium, and other nations also built colonies, particularly in the late 19th century scramble for Africa. In the alternative history, French colonial expansion proceeds more vigorously throughout the century, creating a more balanced competition for colonial territories and potentially different patterns of imperial rule and resistance. The ideological development of Europe in our actual 19th century saw liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and conservatism all contend for influence. The specific forms these ideologies took were shaped by the defeat of Napoleon and the restoration that followed. In the alternative history, the persistence of Napoleonic influence creates different conditions for the development of political thought. Liberal constitutionalism might evolve differently in dialogue with French examples. Socialist thought might engage with French traditions of equality and meritocracy. Nationalism might take different forms when French cultural and political influence remains strong. The technological and industrial development of our actual 19th century proceeded with Britain as the clear leader, though other nations industrialized as the century progressed. The alternative history suggests a Europe where continental industrialization proceeds somewhat faster, with French state support for technical education and infrastructure creating earlier competition for British industrial dominance. The social consequences of industrialization, the rise of urban working classes, the environmental degradation, all these occur in both timelines,
though perhaps distributed somewhat differently geographically. The cultural and intellectual life of 19th century Europe in our timeline produced remarkable achievements in literature, music, art, philosophy, and science. The alternative history we have explored would produce its own cultural flowering, different in particulars, but perhaps not fundamentally different in overall achievement. The human creativity and intelligence that produced Dickens, Dostoevsky, Marx, Darwin, Pasteur, and Brahms, and countless others would still find expression, though perhaps in somewhat different forms and contexts. The paths not taken always hold a certain fascination. In our actual history, Napoleon's defeat opened the way for a conservative restoration, followed by later revolutions and reforms that eventually created modern liberal democracies and socialist movements. The terrible conflicts of the 20th century, the world wars and ideological struggles, emerged from the specific European state system and balance of power that developed after Napoleon's defeat. Would the alternative history we have explored, with persistent French power and a different European order, have avoided those conflicts or simply channeled them differently? This question remains open to imagination and debate.